I'm Shannon McQueenie. I'm the division head for Bioinformatics and Computational Biology. Normally, these sessions are emceed by Bill Hirsch, who's our chair. He's away. I think he's in DC or some other parts of the planet. And today is a PhD symposium. And for those of you who have not been to one of these before, this is something for our doctoral students that allows them, as they're preparing, so this is not a proposal defense, so they're starting to think about the ideas in which they'll formulate eventually their proposal and the work that they want to do for their dissertation. But this is really for them to explore the field and start to think about where some of the low-hanging fruit are. So these actually can be really rich for other people attending in terms of ideas. Your input and questions are actually critical in a symposium. So please feel free to ask questions. I'm assuming you want to hold them to the end? Yeah, so if we can hold the questions to the end. We do record this, so what we ask is that you raise your hand and we'll run over with the mic. Otherwise, what will happen on the video is no one will hear the question and then Ben will just be talking. So we'll do that. I'm going to briefly, from his prepared bio, just introduce Ben to you. Currently, he's one of our predoctoral fellows. He's on the NIEHS fellowship. He received his BA in psychology. The concentration was in neuropsych in 2011. His MS is from here, and I was able to convince him to continue on to do a PhD. He worked before as a software developer, creating immersive data visualizations, website games, and other forms of interactive media for the web before he came back to do his master's and then eventually his PhD here. And his current research projects involve modeling NGS error rates in sequencing experiments, which had clinical applications. That was part of his master's thesis, as well as theoretical applications of quantum algorithms for biology, medicine, and environmental health. And that's the focus of the symposium today, that second part. His broad research interests include cancer genomics, medical imaging, machine learning, algorithms, data visualization, computational complexity, quantum computing, and quantum algorithms, which I believe is what we call everything in parentheses. He likes it all. And of course, today is his doctoral symposium.
So this algorithm was a way of making recommendation systems more efficient, exponentially more efficient, in fact. And interestingly, in July of this year, there was a paper published by a student at University of Texas, Austin, called Owen Tang, and he was working with his advisor, Scott Aronson. And Scott Aronson had said for his senior thesis he should try and kind of close out the theory around whether quantum computation in this specific instance for a recommendation problem actually should provide an exponential speed up over the classical algorithm. And interestingly, he kind of went around this problem for quite a few months and then finally kind of said to Aronson, you know, I think that this actually isn't true, and I think potentially there's a classical algorithm that could be as efficient as a quantum algorithm. And in July of this year, he published that algorithm, and it actually kind of was pretty interesting because it showed that you could think in terms of quantum information theory and possibly get algorithms that are different and more efficient than the classical ones we developed today. So to kind of get started, my roadmap, I'll provide some historical context. I'll talk about quantum systems and some quantum algorithms and kind of really discuss some basics. And then potential applications for biology medicine, some existing barriers and gaps that, as I've seen them, and then I'll open it up to discussion. So first, some historical context. And this is largely a story of complexity and scalability. So in 1936, Alonzo Church and Alan Turing proposed what's known as the Church-Turing thesis, and this was essentially the combination of two theories they developed that were shown to be equivalent. And you can sum it up essentially that any algorithmic process can be simulated using a Turing machine, which is more or less equivalent to a digital computer. And so this theory has kind of, undergone some revisions, but more or less it's held up. But as we've developed real computers and we've actually started to solve problems with them, it's become clear that there are actually other constraints. And so those constraints can really be put down to two major components, which is time complexity and space complexity. And together we'll generally call them computational complexity. For this talk, I'll really focus on the time complexity component, though. So what is it? Well, canonical algorithms usually have an established time and space complexity, and time complexity can be described using a mathematical formalism, and what it seeks to do is assess the number of elementary computations relative to the size of the input of a function. And so one of the most interesting ones is known as big O notation, and this is the worst case formalism. So this is the idea that if you have an input of a given size, what's the worst case? How large will the solution space that you have to explore be with the size of that input? And this way of thinking about algorithms has actually supported quite a rich structure in computational complexity theory, and it really kind of speaks to some of the practical constraints. It has its limitations, and so what does this actually look like? Is that if we imagine a problem with a linear big O, we see that the input, which is not shown here, the output is essentially the same. We have a linear growth. And then we also have polynomial growth where we have an exponent, say 2 or 3. And these are generally considered easy or tractable problems. And then we also have exponential growth, which I've dimmed maybe a bit prematurely. And this is where we have a doubling of the solution space every time we increase the input by 1 bit. And so these problems are generally considered intractable by digital computers. And there's some ways we can kind of get traction, and I'll go over that. But more or less, those are considered to be very hard problems. You may be wondering why polynomial is considered easy after, for example, like 10 to the 12th is 1 trillion. So if you had a 10-bit input, you would have a trillion, kind of possible solutions to explore. And the reality is, we only really see low polynomial growths most of the time, and you can call it a perk of living in a three-dimensional world. So the second portion of this is the scalability of classical computers. So in the 60s, Gordon Moore quite famously gave the idea of Moore's law, which is that the number of gates on a single processor doubles every 2 years to 18 months. And this has largely been an imperfect but pretty good bulwark against the growth of these problems in a lot of spaces. So we've been able to do a lot of really interesting computational modeling because of the scaling of these chips and how many bits and logical gates we can fit onto these processors. But the reality is we're actually fundamentally reaching a limit, and this is an atomic limit. These gates are getting so small, they're subject to atomic interference and things of that nature. So in 2005, Gordon Moore stated we have another 10 to 20 years before we reach this fundamental limit. And it's now 2018, and particularly in the realm of scientific computing, among the computationalists here, I'm sure we can agree that the amount of data we're generating, sometimes we really can't get traction on certain problems and get certain answers. And so the question is, what do we do at this juncture? And there are effectively two approaches. One's as old as computation itself, and the other is actually fundamentally new. And I'm going to start with the old. So the old is essentially we can use different techniques to make problems more tractable. We can constrain the input space. We can constrain the output space. And we can also use a technique called memoization, where we're essentially storing expensive computations that we can reuse for later if they come up again. We can also apply domain knowledge, such as, will the worst case ever really occur? It's actually pretty common that it doesn't. So that's really great. And then there's also a question of, is there an optimal space-time trade-off? And this is not really a solidly defined thing as far as I know, but memoization, for example, is something that does kind of trade space and time complexity a little bit. And then we can also do parallelization. That's been really useful for the last 10 or 15 years. And the reality, though, is that parallelization is every time you double the number of parallel instances for a computation, you only get half the benefit of the previous speed up you got. So it has diminishing returns. And so the second thing is we could think about, how quantum computation could work. Because, these are basically the tiniest particles that, we really know exist in the physical universe. And so in proceeding, one of the people who really proposed this and was 1981, Richard Feynman. And he, while he didn't really propose quantum computation, he really got at the idea that quantum computation may be a more efficient model than our classical digital computation. And so what he really suggested was that because a quantum computer may perform calculations more efficient, particularly in modeling quantum systems, it may actually also be useful for classical problems. And then further, in 1985, we had David Deutsch, who proposed actually a quantum model for computation. And these together really kind of started to push the field towards, really a theoretical grounding and serious development. And so, well, as I said, Feynman, skip that. So to give you an example of why classical bits can simulate a quantum system that, essentially has a growth in this exponential solution space, if we were to model naively a quantum system with 50 qubits, or quantum bits of information, it would take 1.125 quadrillion classical bits exactly. And so you can imagine modeling a system that's very small with a classical computer is actually very hard. And so what does this provide? If we kind of flip the approach that, a quantum computer or a quantum system basically has this exponential blow up, and we say, okay, well, we have this exponential space. What if we can use that to kind of do classical computations? We can kind of come up with some interesting ideas about how to solve problems. And so in the intervening decades since Feynman and Deutsch, we've seen collaborations between physicists, mathematicians, engineers, computer scientists, and even chemists. And these labors have led to the development of multiple hardware architectures and for quantum computation, and the formalization of many algorithms, and the description of theoretical applications, along with a handful of real-world examples of those applications. From this body of work, particularly in computer science, it's become clear that quantum computation may hold the potential to make certain exponentially bounded problems more tractable. And so what we're talking about is the maroon line right there. Certain classes, or certain examples of NP-hard problems may be more tractable with a quantum computational model. And so before going any further, the question is, well, so what is it? What is quantum computation? And so I'm going to try and provide like a 5 to 10 minute intuition around this. and hopefully it'll resonate. So computers are fundamentally state machines. And classical computers, as I'm sure you all know, use bits of information and manipulate these and their higher order representations using algorithms. And these bits are either a 1 or a 0. And quantum computing is actually fundamentally different because it operates on qubits instead of classical bits. And these can be particles such as an electron or a photon. They can be a superconducting circuit, a trapped ion, a quantum dot, really any system that exhibits quantum mechanical properties. And so there are 4 properties that I'm going to outline that are relevant to quantum systems and in some cases unique. And they are superposition, entanglement, interference, and tunneling. And so I'll start with superposition. So a quantum system can be comprised of this qubit here, and we can actually put it into superposition where it is neither a 1 or a 0, but essentially a state in between, or a probabilistic state. And all quantum systems have an associated wave function, and that's really important, and I'll get to what that means later. And we can actually represent this with the mathematical formulas in the Schrodinger equation, but I won't go into that. And so the probability amplitudes that we see in this superposition are really interesting. And when we measure a quantum bit, it actually collapses to one state, so either a 1 or a 0. And this is based off of the probability amplitude it was encoding. The second most perhaps astounding property in my mind is this idea of quantum entanglement. And it's often described as correlations between parts of a quantum system. Einstein talked about it as spooky action at a distance. And it's distinct from any phenomena we observe in classical physics. And so when we create a fully entangled system of qubits when we create a fully entangled system of qubits in superposition for a quantum system, we can represent an exponential number of states. So for 1 bit, we have 2 possible states. But if we entangle 2 qubits, we actually have 4 possible states. And then if we entangle 3 qubits, we have 8 possible states. And so you can see you're essentially having the state space as you entangle grow exponentially. And so this potentially opens this really large state space that you can model. And so being able to manipulate these entangled states in what's known as Hilbert space is essentially a major reason why quantum computing is believed to be more powerful than classical computing. So another concept is quantum interference. And this is the idea that a quantum system, as we discussed, can occupy a probabilistic Hilbert space. So this is the idea, effectively, that we have essentially these probability amplitudes, and they're represented as waves. And all of these quantum systems can be represented as a wave function. And so if we leverage the properties of entanglement and these probability amplitudes, we can actually interfere to amplify and cancel out amplitudes. So this is what it would look like. And this is actually somewhat analogous to when you wear sound-canceling headphones. They're essentially phasing the sounds in the environment to cancel them out. And so what we can do with this is we can actually amplify probabilities for solutions and cancel probabilities for non-solutions if we're really clever about how we apply these techniques. And so the final property is known as quantum tunneling. And it helps to describe this to imagine an energy landscape. So here we have one, and the green dots represent local minima as we go down a gradient. And the red dot at the bottom is a global minimum. And so in optimization, we may want to minimize an energy function. And this is the same idea as in machine learning, too. And so we're essentially traversing down this gradient, and we ideally want to avoid these local minima. But as we're stepping and walking down, if our steps, not big enough, we won't be able to hop out of the wells as we meet them. So we'll just get stuck. And that's maybe a good solution, but it's not the optimal right here. Conversely, if our step is too big, we're just going to hop around, and we're not really going to hit a global minimum at all, or any minimum, and then we're just not going to get convergence. And so that's kind of the knobs we're turning here. And so in classical physics, we have, say, a ball, and it goes and gets stuck in this local minimum. And there's been a ton of intellectual resources and thought that have gone into, well, how do you get into the global minimum? And we have some techniques and strategies, and they work more or less, but they don't guarantee a global minimum. And if there is an algorithm that does guarantee a global minimum, it's usually very expensive to compute. The quantum contrast is that we actually can have a particle hop to the ground energy state through a barrier. So we actually will see that it'll tunnel right through. And so this is quite an odd behavior. And this is actually a basic idea around a model of quantum computation called adiabatic quantum computation, which is analogous to simulated annealing in classical computation, if you're familiar with that. I won't get too much into this, but this is another property that you should be aware of in thinking about this space. So what's the general quantum algorithmic framework? Well, as I see it, and I can't say it's completely comprehensive, you start by initializing qubits to represent a problem-specific Hamiltonian. And a Hamiltonian is essentially describing the energy of a system, in this case. And then you repeat until the error is reduced to a defined probability. You apply an algorithmically specified sequence of gates simultaneously to the entangled qubits. And this is the Cordier computation. This is where you're basically taking that Hamiltonian and manipulating it in a way that you can start to surface up those probability amplitudes that are associated with the solution. And at the end, you'll measure the resulting properties, and this will probabilistically yield a solution. So algorithms actually, quantum algorithms will oftentimes have an associated error, which is essentially saying that this algorithm will get you the right answer with this many iterations or this many computations up to this small error term. And so what's an example of how this looks? Well, here we have Grover's algorithm, and this is an algorithm for, oftentimes it's discussed in the terms of unstructured database search. And so what you have is two qubits right here that are entangled, and essentially we're moving across time towards the right. And we start by applying what's called a Hadamard gate, and this is, this is the 0, 0. This is our guaranteed position right now. We know that the system is in a 0, 0 state. And this is our target right now, but we don't actually know that. And so we apply a Hadamard gate, and that puts the bits into superposition. So they're entangled together, and that means they have equal probabilities right now. And then we apply a U-gate, and what this does is it actually flips the solution down, right? And this is kind of interesting. And you might think like, okay, well, we have something that's different. Maybe we can find a solution. But this is this could be a negative probability amplitude, while the other ones could be positive. And so you still have like a 25% chance of getting the right answer. So you don't actually know that this is going to yield the right answer. So the core of this algorithm is what's called Grover's diffusion operator. And what it does is it uses that quantum interference to amplify the probability amplitudes of the solution while reducing, using destructive interference, the erroneous solutions. And so you see this growing of the probability, and then you can, after O square root n cycles, you can actually come very close to a guarantee of the right answer. And so what does that kind of translate to in terms of computational complexity? Well, the classical search is actually not that complex. It's ON, right? And that's the blue line right there. But the quantum search is surprisingly efficient. You only have to search the list O square root n times using this method to arrive at what is most likely the right answer. And so you can imagine searching a list of 100 items and having to only look 10 times to get the solution, which is kind of defies common sense. So as mentioned, we also have Shor's algorithm, and Grover's algorithm gives you a pretty reasonable speed up, but it's not one that is, it's not earth-shattering. Maybe interesting, but not earth-shattering. And Shor's algorithm is actually an algorithm that, it has an exponential speed up. So it essentially computes these prime factorizations, as I mentioned, and it exploits this hidden structure using a period finding algorithm. I won't get too much into it, but it then uses these periods of the prime numbers and applies Fourier transforms to create a super polynomial speedup versus its classical counterpart. And so at this point, you may be like, okay, cool, like, how is this relevant, right? And so I'll start by talking a bit about, network inference. So there are actually a lot of algorithms, quantum algorithms that have been published around network inference. So for graph traversals, shortest path, Eulerian tours, click finding, cycles, finding collisions, measuring vertex centralities, and then also connectivity through a directed graph, and assessing bipartiteness. So there's quite a few algorithms, and this is not an exhaustive list. And so to give you a relevant example, a protein receptor with different amino acids can maintain structural similarities, which can yield cross-reactivity with a ligand or binding partner. And so we can actually use this maximal click finding algorithm to explore these similarities in structure using what's known as a protein contact graph. In a protein contact graph, the vertices are the amino acids, and the edges are the points of contact between those amino acids. If you think about the outer topology of the protein, if you find a maximal click, that's a shared topological structure between, say, two proteins if they share that click. And it would be extra interesting if that click is in a protein domain, because then they potentially have some cross-reactivity. And so here's an example of clicks that would be found in a graph. These are essentially, to describe a click, it is a maximally connected set of nodes with edges between each of them. And so there's also a few algorithms that have been proposed for genetics and sequencing. So quite a few multiple sequence algorithms. Some of the interesting ones include Hollenberg, who used Grover's algorithm, or described the theoretical application of Grover's algorithm for multiple sequence alignment and formulated that. We also have Mashul, Laeb, and Batouche, and they described a quantum evolutionary algorithm for doing multiple sequence alignment. And then we also have quantum simulation of phylogenetic trees, and this was proposed by Ellis and Jarvis in 2011. And given the structure of some of these problems, and also the fact that we can potentially use a lot of machine learning algorithms, quantum machine learning algorithms, there are some other potential applications, such as de novo assembly, gene linkage analysis, variant analysis, and sequence homology. And so another, as I hinted, the other application that I see is in machine learning. And there are three authors in 2009 who published an algorithm, Harrow, Hasidim, and Lloyd. And the algorithm is for solving linear equations. And this was a very motivational paper in this space. And preceding them, and even since then, there's been a lot of algorithms that have been proposed, quantum variants of well-known algorithms we use in bioinformatics and clinical informatics all the time. So quantum SVMs by Rubin, Truss, Mosheni, and Lloyd in 2013. Quantum neural networks, these were proposed by Altayevsky in 2001 and recently simulated in 2018 by Farhi and Gutman. And then there's others that have been proposed, such as quantum regression, decision trees, hidden Markov models, k-means, and k-median. And then this is kind of, I know there's a lot of clinical informaticians, and this is by no means my real area of expertise at all, but there are potentially some areas where this could be relevant. If you think about quantum encryption, that could be relevant to EHRs, particularly when we think about, when Shor's algorithm was published, people said, oh, it's going to break encryption at some point in the future. And that may still be true, but there's quantum algorithms for encrypting that may be resistant to those attempts. Quantum communication can also be essentially reveal when a third party is actually looking at a communication line. So for that reason, it may have secured communication on a network. And then also we can think about logistics. So if you think about, say a team or organization has a set of tasks they need to accomplish, and they have members or groups within them that they need to optimize resource distribution among them, potentially optimizing resource distribution can be improved with such algorithms. So in exploring the space, I've kind of mentally been developing a framework. And this isn't the complete thing, but I think this kind of speaks to a lot of the ideas, which is essentially that we have a problem. Say, in this case, I picked a random one, network state attainability. And this can be reduced to Boolean satisfiability. And we could call this a search algorithm. And the application that I had in mind was biological network druggability. And I'm not really sure this is really an interesting question. This was just an example. And so the question is, given an abnormal signaling pathway, is there a perturbation that will alter it into the normal state? And so right now, 2SAT is an NP-hard problem, and this is the complexity for a classical computer. This is the complexity for a quantum computer. And you see that the quantum computer slightly improves upon that, and you see that with the exponent term. It basically halves it right there. And so is the application in quantum application novel? Yeah, probably, because I just kind of made it up. But, but you know, the idea is that if we were thinking about more serious problems, we would actually assess, you know, are these novel applications? You know, why are they novel? Is it because they could actually make something more, you know, is it because they have not been considered? Could they actually not make something more tractable, or will they make something more tractable? And then so, you know, kind of looking into the present and kind of moving towards the practical, you know, what are some of the gaps that I see in kind of thinking about this technology in the space of biology and informatics? Well, what are the relevant computations in problems, computational problems in biology and medicine that quantum algorithms may help address? I think that's one of the biggest questions. You know, if you have these algorithms, what can we use to use them for? And then what are the reductions in time complexity that these algorithms may provide in finding solutions to these problems? So do they actually even improve over the classical algorithm? You know, are we going to have someone like Owen Tang actually develop a really clever classical algorithm that shows no improvement, or kind of eclipses the quantum improvement, rather? And then which improvements will actually translate into a meaningful improvement in our ability to understand research or deliver care? Or, you know, where will an improvement actually make sense, given the resources we'll probably have to deploy to make it happen? And then what are the minimal examples of each computational problem for which we can develop proof of concept? You know, how can we illustrate binding with maybe a very, you know, a small amino acid sequence or some biological molecule? And will that be, you know, interesting and motivational? And then can we demonstrate a quantum advantage by comparing efficiency of the quantum and classical algorithms? So this is, you know, this is already something that's being researched quite intensely this year, among other spaces, and it would be interesting to see whether demonstrations in the biological space would be useful for, you know, for practical purposes in the future. And so where we are now, we're in what's called the noisy intermediate scale quantum era, and that was a term coined by John Preskill, who's a professor at Caltech. And so we have quantum computers, and you can actually publicly access them. For example, IBM has a 5 and 16 qubit system that they've or multiple systems that they've productionized through an API. And they also have a 50 qubit prototype that's not yet available, but these already have programmable APIs. If you know Python, you can actually, you know, make a login, you know, work with the API, download it, and run real computations on a real quantum computer. Intel has a 49 qubit chip that they've discussed. It's, as far as I know, it's currently undergoing testing in the Netherlands with this company QTech, but there's really few details around that. Rigetti Computing is a startup that's very well funded in this space. They have a 19 qubit API that's been productionized, and they also have a 128 hybrid API that they've announced for 2019, and that was just last week. So it'll be interesting whether they hit that milestone. And Google has a 72 qubit chip that they've claimed they're targeting for this year, but the year is quickly coming to a close, so it's going to be interesting to see whether they hit that milestone. They have no published error rates, but their goal is to essentially go for the error rates they had on the 9 qubit chip, which were quite low. And then there's D-Wave, which is kind of an interesting case. It's a little different from the others. They have a 2,000 qubit chip, which sounds like a lot, but they, as far as I know, have no published error rates. And it's, it does a very specific model of quantum computation, analogous to simulated annealing. And it's a bit controversial. It seems that the architecture of the system is not quite flexible enough to demonstrate quantum speedups on a lot of problems that people would be interested in. So they do get speedups on very specific instances when it matches the architecture really closely. But how meaningful that is questionable. And so if we look ahead, you know, we have these this kind of mark at 49 qubits. So around 49, 50 qubits, this is where a supercomputer, one of the largest supercomputers in the world, would not be able to actually simulate the system because of the number of exponential states. And so this is kind of the question. This is the fuzzy area boundary. Like, will we start to see a quantum advantage once we go past this number of qubits? And I think that's really what Google and Rigetti are driving towards. But the big question is that can you do that while keeping error rates down? As you entangle more qubits, it gets quite difficult to keep these error rates down because of this property known as decoherence. And if we do get to that point, what are the early applications? We have these potentially quite noisy qubits. Are there algorithms that actually are resilient to that noise? And I actually recently saw an example of an algorithm that, in fact, is resilient to that noise for modeling a molecular hydrogen that was published in 2016. And so noise might actually, excuse me, for certain instances, noise may not be a deal breaker, but clearly if we want to scale computation and really realize its full potential, we need to address the noise issue. And this will probably come in the farther future, decades, with fully error-corrected quantum computation. And so what are the challenges and unknowns regarding this hardware? Well, can we scale a quantum computer to the size required for modeling meaningful computational problems? And I think, most people think that that's probably going to be the case, but it hasn't been done yet, and it's not really guaranteed. Can logical universality be made to scale? And so what this means is that we have a subset of quantum gates that we can use to make a universal quantum computer. Can those gates and their configurations actually be scaled correctly? And then we have quantum computation. Is it actually more powerful than a classical computer? Computational theorists actually don't know this for sure. Like, there's a lot of good indications that it will be. It's clearly very different, but does that actually translate into a more powerful model? That's actually an open question. And then what will the pace of hardware development be? We've seen hardware development progress very rapidly for silicon chips over the decades. And to some degree, we have a track to follow. We've already done this with silicon. Can we do it with a quantum system? And so that's kind of interesting. Maybe we have an upper hand in, or a little bit of a lift in that regard. But, is it going to follow anything analogous with Moore's law? I think that's not particularly clear right now. And so to give some historical perspective, this here is actually a memory unit from a UNIVAC 1 computer from 1951 from Remington Rand. And you can see it's visually actually quite similar in structure to like this 50-qubit prototype in IBM. And I think the big idea you'll think is like these are actually quite large systems. And the chip for the computer is actually here in a refrigerated cooling unit. And these are essentially microwave coax cables that control the qubits. But you can see the control structures are quite large. Can we reduce the control structures? What does miniaturization look for these computers? Is it even relevant? Most people think that these computers are going to be accessed through cloud APIs, so maybe that's not as important. But I think the big idea here is that, in 1951, we didn't really know the impact that digital computers would have on the world. And while I don't think a quantum computer will be quite the same, I think in terms of science and research endeavors, these could actually be really, really valuable in the future. And we don't really know how valuable they may be. So with that, I'm a little bit optimistic as to what applications they may find in the future. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Shannon McQueenie. She let me, kind of pursue this bit of a harebrained topic. And Guan Wu and Lisa Carsons for agreeing to come here today and kind of helping bounce some ideas off regarding this topic. And then Diane Doctor and Lynn Schwab helping organize this. And then, of course, my fellows and peers, DMICE OHSU, and then the NLM NIEHS for supporting this research. And there's a training grant right there. Questions?
Great talk, Ben. So from my very limited understanding, a quantum system is a probabilistic system. And it seems from your talk that by getting humans to think probabilistically, which is really hard to do, we can solve problems that have never been solved before. Do you think training in so-called quantum thinking could be more helpful to decision-making in healthcare?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm not sure that necessarily is true. I think in terms of developing algorithms, it can be useful because you're thinking about abstract problems in a very similar way. I think a lot of the power of this quantum thinking comes not just from the probabilistic component, which is, that's interesting and a definite part of those systems, but it's not really, it's not really what I would say really defines these as a different logical structures you can work with. I think this idea of more entanglement, being able to cause interferences, and this idea of superposition and kind of these suspended states in a Hilbert space, like those are kind of ideas that you may be able to work with to kind of think about certain algorithms and computational problems differently. I'm not sure if that can be extended to an organization. I mean, never say never, but it doesn't, to me, I don't see a clear path for that right now. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you have a practical problem that you can directly, with my students, convert to quantum oracle and test it?
A quantum oracle for Grovers?
No. Grover is one algorithm,
right?
And then when you have particular problem, like graph coloring, traveling salesman, you create the oracle.
Yeah.
So our research concentrates on designing oracles. And it is
Sure.
quite similar to designing computational structures of previous computers, just it is irreversible logic.
Yeah.
So I work with several people in the world that come to me with a problem. Right?
Yeah.
There is a problem in graph schema.
Yeah.
There is a problem in reliability. Okay? And then we think how we can adapt this problem on the Grover to get the quadratic figure.
Sure.
So my question is, do you have such problem now? There is a well-formulated problem like graph coloring, for instance, and just if you give a description of the problem, we can try to design and simulate a quantum algorithm. Actually, now I have a PhD student and we have like 20 different problems, and we're trying to create some kind of methodology.
Sure.
What kind of logs, how to connect them, what should be the rotation operator, and so on.
Yeah. That's a great question. I can't bring you an exact example off the top of my head. And I'm guessing you're referring to biological problems in general.
Yeah.
So I think, well, the one example I had with a contact graph for a protein, that may be one way to kind of explore this. And that would be like a click finding, and specifically maximal click, right?
Maximal click is solved.
Is what?
It's solved.
Yeah.
Maximal click is solved. So it must be something similar, okay? For instance, there are several types of graph coloring.
Yeah.
And graph coloring is similar to maximal click. So
Yeah.
maybe you can formulate the problem actually is similar, but not exactly the same as one of the solved. Then it is published after and becomes more interesting.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We actually have some kind of problem. We are working with some large-scale network inference algorithms. For example, we can actually cover a lot of pathways in a neural network, and then try to find the most likely case type in contact with the actually after that kind of network. Should like tens of the world.
I would have to read some papers.
Okay.
I'm sure that there's plenty of them. Every
Yeah.
At least with quadratic speed. But now, after Lloyd papers, we know that many of those problems can be also solved with exponential speed. Or something between.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
I mean, that was effectively my question. It was a little bit unclear to me exactly what direction your project is going. because you've given a very good introduction as to how quantum computing is working and maybe the algorithms you're going to be developing, but it's not exactly clear to me from your presentation what's the application or what your project will be.
Yeah, and I think, to be completely clear, I haven't developed my proposal yet, so I can't say it's completely hashed out. But I do have kind of a tentative direction that I'm looking for, which is essentially to explore the biological modeling space, like what biological problems are currently kind of hard to do or would be interesting to apply these types of algorithms to, and then to kind of see what the delta is in terms of their complexities. And then from there, devise minimal proof of concept subproblems and try and understand, what is the smallest problem that we can model that gets at this idea, and understand, several of those. And then from there, the hope is that, I could begin to start actually, developing those proof of concepts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sure.
And I should have made that clearer. This isn't a proposal defense. It's just the symposium. So he's just giving the background around the area and the way he's trying to think about it.
Okay.
But
so
we don't require them. He will next term have to come up with a proposal. And then your question is dead on. If he gives the whole talk and he hasn't answered that, then it's but this is the background just to generate this kind of discussion. And in fact, the question that we just had before around which problems and start thinking about them. That's why we wanted people here to kind of think about this, about problems that currently are seem intractable, where there might be something that he should be exploring while he puts his proposal together.
Yeah, and you did propose show quite a few of them, and I thought they were excellent problems for investigation. Yeah, we run into quite a few of those ourselves.
Well, one of the things I think I've talked to you about already is thinking about how this might apply to neuroimaging, given that we're often dealing with, at this case right now, 90,000 vertices in a given network, and that's just for an individual subject, depending on how you want to model things. So one of the things I wanted to ask about is you talked a little bit about graph theory algorithms for operating on networks. And one of the concerns I have with a quantum computer, given the number of qubits, how big of a network can you really handle with current algorithms?
Not very big at all.
So it makes me wonder, so maybe the next challenge is trying to figure out how to be able to handle something like a 90,000 vertex network, which we can do on a digital computer pretty quickly. Yeah. And easily. Well, not quickly and easily. We can do it. So just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think part of that will be solved by scalability, but potentially there are opportunities to do some sort of sampling approaches for the network, but that still doesn't solve a lot of the issues that we come up with classical computers. So how useful is that really?
Well, I mean, there might be ways you could reconstruct a problem, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, you could use a multi-scale algorithm and then develop multiple levels to the network, so you limit the amount of vertices that you're loading in at a given time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
thanks, Eric.
So, while we're on the subject of networks, and this is more of a comment, being in academia, everyone has to bloviate, but so I think there are some really interesting problems. I've been really thinking about random walk-based algorithms, and I think there is some sort of connection between kind of the probabilistic nature of quantum, of basically random walks and basically. So I mean, I'm just I'm trying to make the connections right now. I just don't know exactly what they are.
Sure. So actually, by some accounts, a random walk is considered a quantum computer primitive. So it is actually a process that you can implement on a quantum computer, and there's a ton of research around that being done. Yeah.
Random walk is a special case of quantum walk, and the other algorithm, the most famous practical algorithm, is another special case of quantum walk. It's one of the most developed active areas of research.
Okay, this is.
The problem always is you have to design the oracle, and for all practical problems, I know these oracles are too big, and maybe they'll be for 100 years too big for practical quantum computers.
Okay, that just really made my head hurt, and I'm going to have to think about it. But thanks.
So a related question. In quantum computing, so is there a concept like RAM? So the space, you talk about time complexity, but have people like really discussed about this space complexity, like how big, like in this case, how big a network can really be held for quantum computing, this kind of thing, yeah.
So there's something known as quantum RAM, QRAM, and that is an area that's being discussed a lot. And one of the interesting questions around it is that because you're storing these, when you're using RAM, you're storing data structures in it, and there's a write time and a read time. And one of the questions around these algorithms is you may have a very efficient algorithm, but if it relies on QRAM, which has a certain complexity when it comes to writing and reading the memory, does that actually reduce the gains you have? So RAM is definitely a concept, and it does have a lot of implications, I think, in quantum algorithms, as far as I understand it.
Okay. Yeah. See, another related question, Christian's question. So it is, I believe it is probabilistic computing. Mm-hmm. So how can people actually adapt this kind of probabilistic computing into logical computing, which should not be like in the current classical computing, they are really deterministic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, is there some kind of, do you know how people actually solve this?
Yeah.
I don't know. Why don't you go ahead with your answer?
Okay. So how can you adapt a probabilistic system to actually do some deterministic logical computations? And I think that when you do those measurements, it ends up being, it's probabilistic behind, but you essentially have this kind of the classical world is deterministic. And I don't have a great answer for you. I think that there are some algorithms that are deterministic. I think maybe you can correct me, but there's a lot of the algorithms do adopt this probabilistic framework, and you don't have a guarantee, but you have something pretty close, which is a very high probability down to a very small error term of getting the wrong answer. How you scale that towards a more seemingly deterministic system, I'm not particularly sure right now.
I can add to this that you can make error arbitrarily small if you have sufficient number of qubits. So the problem is again how big is your memory? The memory is a number of qubits, but theoretically you can do error arbitrarily small. Okay. In Grover algorithm, it is probabilistic, but you have 0.999 probability correct result. Okay, and then in all of these problems that I know, you can easily verify. So finding solution is difficult, but verifying is easy. Okay, so just repeat it 3 times.
So then is this like a nature paper for probabilistic graphical model computing? For probabilistic graphical model computing.
I don't know what is defined by it.
Okay, there is this so-called like a basic network. Okay, probably we can talk about this.
Yeah. If there are any more questions,
Yeah, okay.
otherwise we'll wrap it up and people can discuss that.
Well, so to answer your question to some degree, I have seen papers, on implementing potentially Bayesian networks.
Yeah, you can implement any kind of probabilistic networks, but you can also implement deterministic automata, Markov chains. All concepts, basically from classical computer science, can be implemented on a quantum computer, at least with quadratic speed. But, as I thought, probabilistic.
My only contribution to this is maybe think about Bayesianism. Mm-hmm. And I think there is probably some very strong connections between kind of the Bayesian way of probabilistic thinking and quantum computation. In fact, there's a Wikipedia page on it.
Cool. I actually haven't, that's a really great point. I haven't really explored that a whole lot, but it makes sense. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments?
We'll be around if people
Yeah, I'll be around.